Moscow, Idaho, a small rural town surrounded by wheat fields and mountains, a place most people had never heard of until the unimaginable happened. Known mostly as the home of the University of Idaho, Moscow wasn't a town associated with crime. Students walked freely at night, people left their cars unlocked, families raised their children here because it felt safe, peaceful, almost untouched by the outside world. But that all changed in the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022. Four students, bright, full of potential, and deeply loved, were murdered in their sleep inside a small off-campus house. The home was located at 1122 King Road, a well-known address among college students in the area. The kind of place where friends came and went, parties were held, and the door was rarely locked. Inside that home, Kaylee Gunkovs, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were brutally stabbed to death with a fixed-blade knife. No one heard screams. There were no calls to 911 until the next day. Two other roommates were in the home at the time of the killings and survived. From that moment, everything changed. News of the murders quickly spread beyond Idaho. National headlines began asking the same question that haunted the town. Who would do something like this? Within 24 hours, Moscow was flooded with FBI agents, state police, and forensic experts. The crime scene, a seemingly quiet student house, became the epicenter of one of the most gripping murder investigations in recent American history. As days passed with no suspect and no answers, fear spread across campus. Some students packed up and went home early. Parents called constantly, terrified for their children's safety. Residents began locking their doors for the first time in years. Police were tight-lipped. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was it a targeted killing? A random act? Could it be someone the victims knew? Then came the chilling details. A knife sheath found next to one of the victims. Surveillance footage of a white Hyundai Elantra seen circling the neighborhood. Cell phone data placing a man near the house. Multiple times in the weeks before the murders. And finally, a name. Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old PhD student studying criminology at Washington State University, just 10 miles from the crime scene. He had no criminal record. He was quiet, studious, some said odd, others said brilliant. He had studied serial killers. He was obsessed with crime scenes. And now, he stood accused of committing one of the most disturbing crimes in Idaho's history. In July 2025, Bryan Kohberger shocked the world by pleading guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder, avoiding the death penalty but offering no explanation. No motive, no confession, no words for the victims' families. And so the questions remain. Why these 4 students? Why this house? Why didn't he run? What made Bryan Kohberger do what he did? This case continues to fascinate and disturb, not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the eerie silence that surrounds it. There's no known connection between the victims and the killer. No social media links, no threatening messages, no reason. And perhaps that's the most terrifying part of all, because if there was no reason, then it could have been anyone. This is Cold Case Vault, and this is the chilling story of the University of Idaho murders. Before we dive deeper into the investigation, the evidence, or the killer himself, we need to talk about the victims. Because this story isn't just about the crime. It's about the people whose lives were taken. 4 young students with futures, families, and dreams. Let's begin with Kaylee Gunkovs. Kaylee was 21 years old. She was born and raised in Rathdrum, Idaho, and was the 5th of 5 children, the baby of her family. Her parents described her as ambitious, confident, and endlessly loving. Kaylee was a senior at the University of Idaho, majoring in general studies, But she had plans beyond that. She had just bought a new Range Rover and was planning to move to Texas for a tech job. She'd already landed a position and had big dreams for her future. She was bright, bold, and full of life. She had a loud laugh and a strong sense of loyalty, especially to her best friend, Madison Mogan. Madison, also 21, had been Kaylee's best friend since the 6th grade. The two were inseparable. They grew up together, went to the same schools, even worked at the same restaurant in high school. Madison was studying marketing at the University of Idaho and was known for her warmth, her humor, and her kindness. She had a magnetic personality and was deeply loved by her sorority sisters in Pi Beta Phi. Together, Kaylee and Madison were like sisters, roommates, confidantes, and best friends through every chapter of life. On the night they died, they were reportedly sleeping in the same bed. That's how close they were. Next is Xana Kernodle, 20 years old. Xana was from Post Falls, Idaho, and was studying marketing at the University of Idaho, just like Madison. She was known for being energetic, down-to-earth, and hardworking. She worked part-time at a local restaurant called Mad Greek, the same one where Madison had also worked. Xana had a sharp sense of humor and was always described as fiercely independent. She loved dancing on TikTok, hanging out with friends, and going on adventures. She was dating Ethan Chapin, the final victim in this tragedy. Ethan, 20, was a triplet, one of 3 siblings, all attending the University of Idaho. He was studying recreation, sport, and tourism management. He had just attended a fraternity party with Xana the night of the murders. Ethan was goofy, kind-hearted, and always smiling. He had a special bond with his brother and sister, and he was known as someone who could brighten any room he walked into. Xana and Ethan had been together for a while. They were seen often around campus holding hands, laughing, and supporting each other through the stress of college life. The 4 of them, Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan, were all in the prime of their lives. They were students, friends, co-workers, and family members. They were the kind of people who lit up their surroundings, who had plans and purpose, and they were loved deeply. In the weeks after their deaths, tributes poured in from across the country. Candlelight vigils were held on campus. Hundreds of students stood shoulder to shoulder in freezing weather to honor their memory. Family members spoke through tears, sharing stories about each victim, about the kind of people they were, about the futures they never got to live. Social media was flooded with photos, videos, and tributes. Their faces were everywhere, not as headlines, but as reminders of everything that had been taken away. Before their names were attached to a crime scene, they were daughters, sons, siblings, and friends. And for their families, November 13th wasn't just a tragedy. It was the day their world ended. That's who this case is really about. The lives stolen, the futures lost, and the memory of 4 students who should still be here today. To understand the chilling nature of this case, we need to walk through the final hours before everything changed. November 12th, 2022. It was a Saturday night like any other in a college town. The air was cold, but the weekend energy was high. Students were out at parties, bars, and late-night food spots. For the 6 people living at 1122 King Road, a 3-story house near the University of Idaho campus, it was supposed to be a typical Saturday night. That home had become well known among students. It wasn't fancy, but it had history. A place where roommates hosted friends, where music played and life happened. Inside were 6 young people: Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin, and 2 surviving roommates whose names would later be redacted from public records for privacy. Let's follow the timeline. 10 p.m. Kaylee and Madison leave their house and head to a local bar in downtown Moscow. It's called the Corner Club, a popular spot where students hang out. Surveillance footage shows them laughing, talking, completely unaware of what's to come. 10 to 11 p.m., Xana and Ethan are attending a party at the Sigma Chi fraternity house, just a short walk away from the King Road residence. The two are seen chatting with friends and enjoying the night like any college couple might. 1:30 a.m., Kaylee and Madison leave the bar and walk toward a nearby food truck parked downtown. A live Twitch stream from the food truck would later capture both girls standing in line, waiting for their late-night meal. Their behavior is normal. Nothing seems off. 1:56 a.m., after grabbing their food, the girls catch a ride home. They're dropped off at the King Road house around this time. Meanwhile, Xana and Ethan return from the frat party around 1:45 a.m. All four victims are now inside the home. At this point, the house appears calm. Nothing strange is noticed. But then, sometime between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m., something terrible happens. According to police reports and surviving roommate statements, a man enters the house, moving from room to room, floor to floor. There are no signs of forced entry. The sliding glass door on the second level may have been left unlocked. Something not uncommon in a house filled with friends and guests. What happened next was fast and brutal. The killer moved through the house in near silence. Autopsy reports later revealed that the victims were stabbed multiple times, most likely in their sleep. Kaylee and Madison were found in the same bed, both murdered on the top floor. Xana and Ethan were found on the second floor. Reports suggest Xana may have fought back. Defensive wounds were noted on her hands. She may have been awake when the attack occurred. A surviving roommate later told investigators that she awoke around 4 a.m. to what she thought was crying. She opened her bedroom door multiple times. On the final time she opened it, she says she saw a man in black clothing and a mask covering his mouth and nose. He walked past her and toward the sliding door, then left the house. She locked her door and didn't call 911. The exact reasons why are still unclear. Trauma, shock, confusion. All are possible explanations. 11:58 a.m. The next morning, a 911 call is placed from inside the home. The caller believes someone is unconscious. Police arrive minutes later. What they find is beyond what anyone could have imagined. 4 young people, gone. Stabbed in their own home, in the middle of the night, without a sound loud enough to alert the neighborhood. No one knew who did it, no one knew why, and no one saw it coming. But in the hours after that call, a massive investigation would begin, and it would uncover a chilling trail leading to someone no one expected. Sunday morning, November 13th, 2022. The town of Moscow, Idaho, was still and quiet. It was cold, with morning frost on car windows and lawns. Inside the King Road house, something was very wrong. At 11:58 a.m., a call came in to 911. The call originated from a cell phone inside the home. The dispatcher's log was vague. The person calling reported an unconscious individual on the second floor. Officers from the Moscow Police Department responded within minutes. What they discovered would shock not only this small town, but the entire country. When police arrived, they were let in by surviving roommates and friends who had been called over to the house. According to the police affidavit, the scene was chaotic. The surviving roommates had locked themselves in their rooms during the night and were unaware of what had occurred. It's important to understand something here. The surviving roommates didn't know their friends had been murdered. To them, it seemed like something else was wrong. Maybe someone passed out. Maybe someone wasn't waking up. But what they were about to walk into was something completely unexpected. The officers moved through the house room by room. What they found was horrifying. 4 young people had been stabbed to death: Madison Mogan, Kaylee Goncalves, Ethan Chapin, and Xana Kernodle. There were no gunshots, no loud disturbances, no signs of forced entry. The killer had entered and left with terrifying stealth. Police would later describe the scene as one of the most disturbing in recent memory. Blood was found on the walls, on bedding, and even reportedly seeping through the exterior walls of the home. The attack had happened hours earlier, most likely between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m., while the rest of the world slept. The biggest mystery in those first hours? Why did it take until nearly noon for someone to call 911? As investigators interviewed the surviving roommates, it became clear that trauma and confusion had played a major role. One roommate said she heard what sounded like crying around 4 a.m. and thought she heard someone say, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." She opened her door several times. On the last time, she saw a tall man dressed in black with bushy eyebrows walking past her. He wore a mask that covered his mouth and nose. Frightened, she locked her door and didn't move. She didn't call 911, possibly believing it was some kind of fight or drunken misunderstanding. The fact that she survived and that the killer left her alive remains one of the most chilling aspects of the case. After confirming the deaths, the house was quickly sealed off as a crime scene. Moscow police requested assistance from the Idaho State Police and the FBI. Local news began reporting a quadruple homicide in the usually peaceful college town. The phrase "unconscious person" in the original 911 report didn't begin to capture the horror of what had occurred. Families were contacted. Students across campus were in shock. Rumors began to swirl. At first, no one knew who had done it or why. Was this a targeted attack? A stalker? A jealous ex? Was it random? Could the killer strike again? Police were tight-lipped early on, trying to protect the integrity of the investigation. But their silence created fear and frustration. Parents of the victims spoke out. Kaylee's father, in particular, criticized the police response, saying it felt like they weren't being transparent. The case was now national news. True crime fans, social media sleuths, and TV networks all descended on Moscow. Everyone wanted answers. But behind the scenes, investigators were already working a list of clues. And one in particular was about to become very important. A white Hyundai Elantra seen speeding away from the area around the time of the murders. In the days immediately following the murders, law enforcement found themselves under a national spotlight. The brutal stabbing of 4 college students in a quiet college town wasn't just a local tragedy. It had become a national mystery. While the public waited for answers, behind the scenes, investigators from the Moscow Police Department, Idaho State Police, and the FBI were hard at work trying to make sense of what little they had. The killer had left no murder weapon, no fingerprints, and had slipped in and out of the house without anyone calling 911 for nearly 8 hours. But there were clues, and one by one, they began to surface. By November 25th, nearly 2 weeks after the murders, the police made a key announcement. They were looking for a white 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra seen in the area during the early morning hours of the murders. This small piece of information would change the course of the investigation. A security camera from a nearby gas station, one that faced a major intersection near the victim's home, had picked up a white vehicle passing by multiple times. In total, they tracked it, traveling past the King Road house at least 4 times between 3:29 and 4:20 a.m. At 4:20 a.m., the car sped away at high speed. That detail lined up almost perfectly with the estimated time of the murders. So who owned that car? And why was it there at that exact time? Next, investigators began to piece together data from cell towers and phone pings. One of the most powerful tools in modern criminal investigations is what's called cell site location information, CSLI. Basically, phone records showing where a device was located when it connected to nearby cell towers. Authorities requested this data from cell phone providers. What they found was another chilling detail. A cell phone registered to Brian Koberger, a 28-year-old criminology PhD student at Washington State University, had been near the King Road house on at least 12 separate occasions prior to the murders. That wasn't all. On the morning of November 13th, just hours after the killings, Koberger's phone went offline for nearly 2 hours, exactly during the murder window. Then, it magically reconnected to the network later that morning on a highway far from Moscow. To seasoned investigators, this wasn't coincidence. It was intent. Even though the killer had tried to leave nothing behind, they made a critical mistake. Left on Madison Mogen's bed, next to her body, was a leather knife sheath from a military-style K-bar knife. It had a U.S. Marine Corps insignia, and more importantly, a single male DNA sample left behind on the snap. But how do you match that DNA to a suspect if they aren't in any law enforcement database? That's where genetic genealogy comes in. A revolutionary forensic technique that's been used to solve cold cases for years. Using that tiny DNA trace, analysts built a partial family tree by comparing it to samples from public genealogy databases. From that tree, the name Brian Koger surfaced. He matched the age, location, profile, and, thanks to surveillance, the vehicle they were looking for. At the time of the murders, Koberger was living just 10 miles away in Pullman, Washington. He wasn't just any student. He was pursuing a PhD in criminology and forensic psychology. In fact, he had posted surveys online asking ex-cons about how they picked their victims and how they felt during their crimes. It was an eerie coincidence, or perhaps a sinister glimpse into the mind of the killer. When investigators learned about his studies and his interest in criminal behavior, red flags shot up immediately. This wasn't just someone who might be capable of murder. This was someone who had studied how to get away with it. By mid-December, police had enough evidence to move in. Between the DNA, the car, the cell phone data, and behavioral profiling, they were confident. Brian Koberger was their prime suspect. On December 30th, nearly 7 weeks after the murders, Koberger was arrested in Pennsylvania at his parents' home, thousands of miles from the crime scene. He had driven cross-country with his father in that same white Hyundai Elantra. His arrest marked a turning point, but the questions were far from over. Why did he do it? Why these victims? And what did he do during those missing 2 hours? Brian Christopher Koberger was not an obvious suspect, at least not at first glance. Born in 1994 in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, he grew up in a fairly ordinary, quiet part of the Poconos. His childhood seemed relatively uneventful, though there were signs early on that he didn't always fit in. Former classmates later described him as socially awkward, intensely quiet, and often bullied. As he got older, that awkwardness gave way to something darker. In his teenage years, Kober began experiencing a series of personal struggles. He reportedly battled a form of obsessive-compulsive behavior and developed an addiction to heroin. At one point, he was sent to rehab, and it seemed like he was on a path of recovery. That recovery included a renewed focus on academics. He enrolled in college, eventually earning a psychology degree from DeSales University in Pennsylvania, where he would later go on to earn a master's degree in criminal justice. It was during his graduate studies that Koberger became fixated on the criminal mind. Professors noted his interest in the psychology of criminals, and he even worked under renowned forensic psychologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland, an expert on serial killers. He wasn't just studying crime, he was immersing himself in the minds of those who committed the most violent acts. Koberger didn't just want to understand how criminals behaved. He wanted to know how they got away with it. By the fall of 2022, he had moved across the country to attend Washington State University in Pullman, just 10 miles from the University of Idaho. There, he began his PhD in criminology. On paper, he was a promising academic. He had even applied to intern at the Pullman Police Department, claiming he wanted to help rural law enforcement agencies understand how to collect and analyze data more effectively. But beneath the surface, his behavior was concerning to some. Students who had classes with Koberger described him as cold, often dominating conversations, and correcting classmates and professors alike. Teaching assistants said he was a harsh grader, almost to a point of cruelty. But then, something strange happened. In early November, right around the time of the murders, his behavior shifted. He suddenly became more lenient with students, quieter in class, and seemed preoccupied. It was subtle, but in hindsight, that change seemed ominous. Then there were the online posts. Before the murders, Koberger had posted a Reddit survey targeting individuals who had committed crimes. The questions were invasive and specific. How did you leave the scene? How did you feel afterward? What was your first move after committing the crime? It read less like academic curiosity and more like a blueprint. At the time, no one flagged the post as suspicious, but in light of what happened later, it took on a new meaning. After the murders, he didn't flee the area immediately. He returned to his life as if nothing had happened. He attended classes, held office hours, and even engaged in normal academic discussions. But investigators were watching. Surveillance teams tracked him as he cleaned out his car meticulously, wearing gloves even when entering a grocery store. He shaved his beard and attempted to change his appearance. These weren't the actions of an innocent man. They were the desperate efforts of someone trying to cover their tracks. Back home in Pennsylvania, friends and neighbors were shocked by his arrest. To them, Koberger was just a quiet, intelligent guy who liked books and hiking. But for law enforcement, the puzzle pieces were starting to form a full picture. This was a man who had studied the system, who believed he was smarter than everyone else, and who thought he could commit the perfect crime. But even the smartest criminals leave something behind. In Koberger's case, it was DNA, digital footprints, and a psychological profile that pointed directly at him. As the case moved toward trial, the question lingered. Was Koberger trying to live out a fantasy? Was this an experiment gone horribly wrong? Or was it always more sinister than that? The world would have to wait for the courtroom to find out, but the deeper investigators dug into his background, the more disturbing the picture became. The DNA evidence was the turning point. It was the moment everything shifted from suspicion to certainty. Investigators had collected a tan leather knife sheath found next to the bodies of Kaylee and Maddie. On that sheath was a single male DNA sample, small, almost invisible, but enough to be analyzed. In early December, police sent the sample for genealogical testing, hoping to connect it to someone in a family tree. What came back led them straight to Brian Koberger's father. Once the match was made, law enforcement quietly ramped up surveillance on Koberger. They tracked his movements, his phone data, and even his trash. On December 27th, investigators retrieved garbage from the Koberger family home in Pennsylvania. Inside was a discarded item, possibly a tissue, that contained DNA. It was a match. Not just a match to the sheath, but a match that confirmed Brian Koberger had likely been inside that off-campus house in Moscow, Idaho, on the night 4 students were murdered. By this point, authorities had built a timeline that was deeply unsettling. Koberger's white Hyundai Elantra had been spotted by multiple surveillance cameras near the King Road residence. Cell tower pings showed his phone in the vicinity of the house in the early hours of November 13th. At times, the phone was turned off, only to turn back on again hours later as he drove back toward Pullman. When police reconstructed the vehicle's movements, they realized the car had circled the neighborhood multiple times before the attack, almost as if he was waiting for something. Or someone. Even more disturbing was the fact that Koberger had reportedly visited the King Road area at least a dozen times before the murders. His cell phone had pinged near the house repeatedly in the weeks leading up to the killings. It suggested premeditation. It suggested obsession. Maybe even stalking. On December 30th, just days after the DNA was matched, Brian Koberger was arrested in a dramatic early morning raid at his parents' home. The SWAT team moved in fast. Koberger was found wearing latex gloves. Inside the house, investigators seized his laptop, phone, and various personal items. The car was impounded, and the internet erupted. The public's response was swift and intense. Online sleuths began combing through his digital footprint. School records, Reddit posts, academic articles. Every piece of data became a clue. Every word he had ever written, a possible insight into his state of mind. Some even theorized that Koberger had joined online discussion forums about the murders after they occurred. Whether he was tracking the investigation out of anxiety or thrill, no one could say for sure. The probable cause affidavit released by Idaho authorities only deepened the mystery. It laid out the evidence in chilling detail. One surviving roommate, Dylan Mortensen, told police she saw a masked man dressed in black leaving the house that night. She had been frozen with fear and locked herself in her room. That witness account, paired with the knife sheath, the surveillance footage, and the phone data, painted a haunting picture of the hours before dawn. As he sat in jail, awaiting extradition, Koberger didn't speak. His attorneys issued brief statements about his intention to clear his name. But to many, it seemed the evidence was too strong. The timeline, the car, the DNA, the behavior, it all fit. And yet, questions remained. What was his motive? Did he know the victims personally? Was this the act of a calculating psychopath or a mentally disturbed individual trying to prove something? For the families of the victims, the arrest brought a mix of relief and agony. They now had a name, a face, but not closure. Because no arrest can undo the horror of what happened that night. No trial can bring back the futures that were stolen. And no sentence can explain the depths of human cruelty. But one thing was clear. Brian Koberger wasn't just a suspect. He was a criminology student who believed he could outsmart the system. And in the end, the very knowledge he relied on became the net that closed in around him. Even after Brian Koberger's arrest, one question loomed over the entire case like a shadow. Why? What could possibly have driven a 28-year-old PhD student in criminology, someone who was studying the criminal mind in order to understand it better, to commit such a brutal and senseless act? The lack of a clear motive haunted both investigators and the public. Unlike many murder cases where jealousy, rage, or revenge offer at least some explanation, this one offered no obvious reason. There were no public records showing that Koberger had any known relationship with the victims. No text messages, no photos, no social media interactions that linked him directly to Maddie, Kaylee, Xana, or Ethan. That absence of connection made the murders feel even more terrifying. If a stranger could just fixate on a group of innocent students, stalk them for weeks, and then walk into their home in the dead of night to end their lives, then what did safety even mean anymore? Some speculated that Koberger may have seen the victims around town or at the University of Idaho. Kaylee and Maddie were active on social media. They posted frequently. Their lives were visible, beautiful, normal. And to someone like Koberger, maybe that triggered something dark and obsessive. Some reports claimed he followed Kaylee and Maddie on Instagram prior to the murders, though this was never officially confirmed. Others pointed to his academic background, wondering if he had chosen the victims as part of some twisted experiment or personal test. His former classmates at Washington State University described him as quiet, awkward, and intensely analytical. He was known to dominate conversations in class, often steering discussions toward serial killers, criminal behavior, and forensic evidence. Some said he made others uncomfortable with how casually he spoke about violent crimes. Others didn't think much of it. After all, he was a criminology student. Talking about crime was his academic world. But still, the deeper people looked into his past, the more concerning it became. In high school and college, Koberger had reportedly struggled with drug addiction. He was known to be socially isolated. He had once posted on an internet forum about feeling detached from his emotions and people around him, writing about his experience with visual snow, anxiety, and feeling like his life was a simulation. It painted the picture of someone who was disconnected from reality in a way that could explain a total lack of empathy. What remained unnerving, though, was how calculated the attack appeared. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a meticulously timed, surgically executed plan. Koberger had allegedly parked his car a few houses down to avoid being seen. He had turned off his phone during the murders. He left behind very little physical evidence, except the knife sheath. A single mistake. And that mistake might have been the only thing that unraveled his plan. Investigators believe that had he not dropped the sheath, this case could have taken months, even years, to solve. That detail led many to believe Koberger felt invincible, or that he was testing himself. Some crime analysts suggested that he wanted to experience what it felt like to carry out the perfect crime and get away with it. A chilling theory that aligns disturbingly well with his academic interests. Even as his arrest sent shockwaves through the community, Koberger's demeanor in court offered little clarity. He showed no visible emotion during his arraignment. He wore an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled, his face blank. He waived extradition and was quickly transferred back to Idaho to face charges. 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of felony burglary. The families of the victims sat in the courtroom, looking at the man accused of taking everything from them. There were no outbursts, no tears, just silent, painful endurance. Some of the parents later said they had expected to feel something: rage, closure, even fear. But instead, they just felt empty. Because the truth is, no arrest and no trial could ever answer the question that matters most: why? And as the legal process moved forward, that question remained at the center of everything. Investigators continued to search for any indication of motive, anything that would explain the unexplainable. But in the absence of answers, What lingered was the horror of what happened, and the haunting knowledge that sometimes monsters wear ordinary faces. The courtroom became the next stage in this chilling story, and every hearing pulled in massive public interest. Cameras weren't allowed inside during the earliest proceedings, but reporters painted vivid pictures of what was unfolding. Koberger, now infamous nationwide, stood quietly as charges were read. Each time he appeared, he seemed composed, emotionless, robotic even, his face unchanged, his voice flat. People wanted him to crack, is to show remorse, fear, something. But he didn't. The prosecution quickly laid out the strength of their case. They had DNA from the knife sheath that matched Koberger. They had cell tower data showing him near the crime scene multiple times before the night of the murders. They had security footage placing his white Hyundai Elantra near the victim's house. They even had footage from his parents' home showing him trying to clean his car meticulously in the days after the killings. The circumstantial evidence was stacking up like bricks in a wall. His defense team tried to poke holes. They questioned the reliability of the DNA evidence. They pointed out that cell towers cover wide areas and don't place him exactly at the house. They argued that the media frenzy surrounding the case could make a fair trial impossible. But to most observers, the evidence looked overwhelming. And with every new document released, every police affidavit filed, more disturbing details emerged. One of the most chilling revelations came from the surviving roommate. She reported seeing a figure dressed in black inside the house the night of the murders. He walked right past her, face masked, bushy eyebrows visible, and out the sliding glass door. She froze in fear, locked her door, and didn't call police until the next day. Some people criticized her for not calling immediately, but most understood she was in shock, terrified, and probably processing what she had just witnessed. Her experience became a critical piece of the timeline. Meanwhile, the families of the victims struggled to cope not only with their loss, but with the constant media attention. Kaylee's parents were the most vocal, often speaking to reporters and sharing their frustration with the pace of the investigation and the justice system. They wanted answers. They wanted the death penalty. But most of all, they wanted the world to remember who their daughter was, not just how she died. As the pretrial motions continued, the judge issued a gag order, barring attorneys from speaking publicly. The goal was to preserve the integrity of the trial. But that didn't stop the public from speculating. Reddit threads, TikTok videos, and YouTube breakdowns flooded the internet, dissecting every move, every court filing, and every possible motive. It became a true crime circus, and at the center was a man who refused to speak. For many, the mystery wasn't just in the crime itself, it was in the silence. Koberger never confessed. He never gave a reason. He pleaded not guilty. And with no confession, no suicide note, no manifesto, the motive remained buried. That void turned him into an object of both fear and fascination. People wanted to know how someone could study criminal behavior for years and still choose to become the very thing he was supposedly analyzing. The trial was set to be one of the most high-profile in Idaho's history. Security was tightened. News outlets scrambled for access. Everyone wanted the moment where the truth would finally come out, where Koberger would speak. But there was no guarantee he ever would. His attorneys hinted that he would maintain his innocence. There was talk of filing motions to suppress evidence, even some discussion of moving the trial to another county due to the intense media coverage. Still, the families waited. The public waited. And while the system moved slowly, as it always does, the pain remained fresh. The scars on the community hadn't healed. Students at the University of Idaho remained fearful, many still avoiding late nights out or locking doors even during the day. The house where it all happened, 1122 King Road, stood eerily quiet, boarded up, a grim reminder of what had occurred inside. Justice, in cases like this, is never simple. It doesn't come with one verdict or one sentence. It comes in pieces, slow, painful, and never truly complete. And as the case moved forward, the world watched, hoping that in the long and winding path through the court system, some kind of closure might be found.